Leviticus is the book where morality stops being about how you treat people and starts being about how clean you are, who you touch, what you eat, what your body does, and whether you're allowed near God at all. Leviticus is not about morality, it's about control through purity. This is the moment the system fully locks in. Leviticus transforms ethics into ritual compliance, harm into contamination, conscience into inspection, community into hierarchy, and care into enforcement. It doesn't ask whether anyone was hurt, it asks whether the rules were followed. At its core, Leviticus answers one question relentlessly: who is allowed near power and under what conditions? If Genesis breaks you and Exodus controls you, then Leviticus is where you are monitored, not to make you better, but to make you manageable. In Leviticus, moral value is systematically detached from harm, intent, and repair, and reattached to ritual status. Actions are not evaluated by whether they injure another person, exploit the vulnerable, or fracture trust. They're evaluated by whether they render someone or something unclean. Moral failure is reframed as contamination. The central question is no longer who was harmed, but what was touched. Ethics give way to hygiene. This shift is foundational. A person can obey every purity regulation while causing real harm and still be considered morally acceptable. Conversely, someone can commit no harm at all and yet be treated as morally compromised simply for coming into contact with the wrong substance, body, or space. Goodness becomes spatial and procedural rather than relational. Morality is no longer about how humans treat one another, it's about maintaining the correct boundaries around the sacred. Psychologically, this produces an anxiety based moral framework. When goodness is defined by purity, vigilance replaces empathy. People are trained to constantly monitor their bodies, their movements, their proximity to others, and their compliance with visible rules. Moral life becomes a state of alertness rather than a practice of care. Instead of asking how to respond compassionately to another person, individuals learn to ask whether engagement itself is risky. Fear of contamination overrides concerns for consequence. Over time, this reshapes emotional instincts. Compassion becomes dangerous because it often involves closeness. Curiosity becomes risky because it may cross boundaries. The safest moral posture is withdrawal and strict rule following. The safest moral posture is withdrawal and strict rule following. This does not produce ethical maturity, it produces compliance. People learn how to avoid being wrong, not how to do what is right. Purity systems are extraordinarily easy to enforce. Purity is visible, it can be inspected, regulated, and policed. Ethics are complex, contextual, and often inconvenient for power. Purity, by contrast, reduces morality to checklists and categories. This favors authorities who control definitions and procedures, and it favors individuals who excel at rule following rather than moral reasoning. Power flows toward those who can enforce boundaries, not those who can repair harm. The result is a moral culture that rewards conformity over conscience. Communities become preoccupied with appearances rather than outcomes, compliance rather than compassion. Harm can persist undisturbed as long as the rules are followed, while harmless people can be excluded for technical violations. Once morality is reduced to cleanliness, injustice no longer needs to be justified, it simply needs to be labeled. This is why the core question of Leviticus is so revealing. It does not ask whether anyone was harmed, it asks only whether something was touched. In Leviticus, the human body is not treated as morally neutral or inherently trustworthy. It's treated as a recurring liability. Ordinary biological processes such as menstruation, ejaculation, and childbirth are classified as sources of impurity, requiring separation, waiting periods, and ritual remediation. These are not acts of harm, excess, or even exploitation. They are unavoidable functions of being alive. Yet the text refrains them as spiritual risks that must be managed, contained, and corrected before normal participation in community life can resume. This framing quietly redefines what it means to be human. Biology itself becomes suspicious. The body is no longer the site of experience, connection, and continuity. It is a contamination vector. Moral standing fluctuates not with behavior, but with bodily state. A person can move in and out of acceptability without any ethical change at all, simply by existing in a body that leaks, bleeds, or reproduces. Humanity becomes something that must be periodically cleansed. This produces deep body shame and disassociation. When natural processes are treated as defiling, people learn to experience their own bodies with suspicion or disgust. Sensation becomes something to monitor rather than inhabit. Desire, arousal, and reproduction are not integrated into a healthy sense of self. They're compartmentalized as problems to be endured and corrected. Over time, this fractures the relationship between mind and body, teaching individuals to mistrust their own physical existence. This internalized disgust has lasting consequences. People raised in such frameworks often struggle to distinguish between harm and discomfort, ethics and biology. The body becomes a source of anxiety rather than wisdom. Instead of listening to physical cues, pain, pleasure, fatigue, connection, individuals learn to override them in favor of external approval. The self is no longer experienced as whole, it's managed. Sociologically, these purity rules are not neutral. They fall unevenly, especially on women, because menstruation, childbirth, and postpartum recovery are recurring and visible. Women's bodies are treated as ongoing moral threats to communal purity. Exclusion becomes cyclical, participation becomes conditional, authority remains disproportionately male, while women are repeatedly positioned as sources of risk rather than agents of meaning. This is not incidental, it is structural gendered control embedded in ritual logic. The broader effect is a culture that confuses biology with danger and difference with defilement. Bodies that do not conform, female bodies, sick bodies, disabled bodies, are more easily marginalized because the system already treats embodiment as a problem to be solved rather than a reality to be honored. Leviticus does not merely regulate behavior, it regulates existence itself. In Leviticus, being human is a contamination event. Now, also in this book, sexual behavior is not evaluated through a framework of consent, mutuality, harm, or care. It's regulated almost entirely through purity logic. Acts are prohibited not because they exploit, coerce, or injure another person, but because they violate prescribed boundaries about bodies' roles and categories. The moral question is not, was anyone harmed, but does this disrupt the order? Sexual ethics are replaced with sexual compliance. What is striking is what's missing. There is no consent framework, no concern for power imbalance, no attention to emotional well being, coercion, or reciprocity. A sexual act can be mutually desired, non exploitative, and harmless, and still be condemned outright. Conversely, the text offers little critique of sexual arrangements that reinforce hierarchy as long as they conform to approved structures. The issue is not ethics, it's control. This framing casts desire itself as danger. Sexual impulse is treated as a force that must be restrained, surveilled, and suppressed rather than understood or integrated. Shame replaces discernment. Instead of learning how to navigate desire responsibly through communication, empathy, and self awareness, people learn to fear it. Internal moral reasoning is short circuited by external prohibition. Desire becomes something to hide, deny, or punish rather than something to engage thoughtfully. Over time, this produces a fractured inner life. People are trained to distrust their own attractions and instincts, interpreting them as threats rather than signals. Moral growth is stunted because discernment requires engagement, not avoidance. When sexuality is governed by fear, secrecy flourishes, honesty diminishes, and harm becomes harder, not easier to address. Sexual regulation functions as a tool for enforcing family structure and social stability. Approved sexual behavior aligns with inheritance, lineage, and property transmission. Anything that falls outside those patterns, nonconformity, non reproductive relationships, queerness, is framed not as difference, but as defilement. The community is taught to see deviation as contamination rather than variation. Criminalization replaces conversation. This logic makes exclusion feel righteous. When nonconformity is labeled impure, removal becomes protection. Punishment becomes preservation. The system does not need to argue why certain relationships are harmful. It only needs to assert that they threaten order. Sexuality becomes a site where power defends itself by narrowing what is allowed. Leviticus then is not primarily concerned with who you love, it is concerned with who you threaten. In Leviticus, violence is not treated as a tragic last resort, it's institutionalized as maintenance. Blood becomes the primary cleansing mechanism. When something is wrong, something must die. Restoration is not achieved through repair, reconciliation, or changed behavior, but through ritual killing. The system does not ask whether harm can be undone. It assumes that order is restored only when blood is shed. This reframes violence as productive. Death is not a failure of the system, it's how the system works. Animals are killed repeatedly, methodically, and publicly, not as symbolic gestures, but as functional requirements. The sheer repetition matters. Sacrifice is not exceptional, it's routine. Peace is not sustained by justice or care, but by an ongoing cycle of sanctioned destruction. The moral imagination is trained to see killing not as disruption, but as upkeep. Psychologically, this produces a desensitization to violence. When bloodshed is normalized as sacred necessity, emotional resistance weakens. Moral responsibility is outsourced upward. God required it, or government required it. Individuals are no longer asked to wrestle with the ethical weight of killing, they are asked only to comply. Violence becomes easier to accept when it is procedural, authorized, and framed as obedience rather than choice. Over time, this erodes ethical agency. If harm is justified by command, then conscience becomes optional. People learn to separate action from accountability, performing violent acts without owning their moral implications. The question shifts from is this right to is this required? And once that shift occurs, almost anything can be done without ethical reflection. Sacrifice creates a ritual economy. Animals, goods, and labor flow toward the altar, and control over the altar controls power. Priests become gatekeepers of forgiveness, purity, and restoration. Access to peace is mediated, regulated, and monetized through ritual participation. This is not incidental, it's structural. When forgiveness requires sacrifice, and sacrifice requires authorized intermediaries, authority consolidates at the center. The system sustains itself through repetition. The more impurity is defined, the more sacrifice is required. The more sacrifice is required, the more indispensable the priesthood becomes. Violence is no longer an emergency response, it's a predictable feature of daily life woven into the rhythm of belonging. Leviticus does not imagine peace as something built through justice or healing. It imagines peace as something purchased. In Leviticus, peace is purchased with blood again and again. Starting with Leviticus, moral authority is formally transferred from the individual to an institutional class. Priests are granted exclusive power to diagnose impurity, determine status, and declare restoration. Starting with Leviticus, moral authority is formally transferred from the individual to an institutional class. Priests are granted exclusive power to diagnose impurity, determine status, and declare restoration. There is no appeal process, no alternative interpretation, and no recognized internal conscience authority. A person's standing is not something they can discern or repair on their own. It must be inspected, named, and approved from above. Moral reality becomes something done to people, not something reasoned with them. This inspection model reshapes how truth itself functions. Impurity is not discovered through reflection or relational accountability, it is declared. Once pronounced, the declaration becomes reality regardless of personal intent, harm caused, or inner conviction. The priest's word overrides the individual's experience of themselves. Moral authority is no longer distributed, it's centralized. Psychologically, this produces learned dependence. When people are trained to distrust their own moral perception, they become reliant on external validation to feel acceptable. Self trust erodes. Instead of asking, "Am I acting with care?" individuals learn to ask, "Have I been cleared?" Anxiety replaces discernment, and approval replaces integrity. Over time, the inner moral compass atrophies from disuse. This dynamic also trains people to silence internal conflict. If conscience disagrees with authority, conscience is treated as unreliable. Doubt becomes suspicion. Moral growth stalls because growth requires reflection, experimentation, and sometimes even disagreement. In its place emerges compliance, safe, predictable, and often rewarded. Sociologically, the priesthood becomes a permanent clerical class. Power flows upward, not because priests demonstrate superior wisdom or ethical insight, but because the system requires gatekeepers. Access to purity, forgiveness, participation, and peace becomes currency. Those who control access control belonging. Resources, labor, and loyalty concentrate around the institution that mediates approval. Once inspection replaces conscience, hierarchy stabilizes. Inequality becomes normalized because it's framed as spiritual order rather than social design. Challenging authority feels dangerous not because it threatens justice, but because it threatens access. The system protects itself by making itself indispensable. Leviticus reveals a simple but enduring truth about power. If you control access to clean, you control the people. What else do we get from Leviticus? Well, illness is not treated as neutral biological condition. It's treated as impurity. Disease becomes a moral and spiritual problem before it is ever a medical one. The primary response is not healing, investigation, or care, but separation. Quarantine is framed not as a public health measure rooted in compassion or prevention, but as ritual necessity tied to holiness. The sick are managed as risks, not supported as people. This framing quietly assigns blame. Even when illness is not explicitly called sin, it's treated as defilement, something that disrupts sacred order simply by existing. The burden shifts onto the afflicted individual who must withdraw, announce their status, and wait for authorization to return. The question is never, "How can we help you recover?" but, "Are you safe to be around?" Disease becomes a condition that threatens the community's purity rather than a human experience that calls for care. This layers guilt onto suffering. Being sick already involves fear, vulnerability, and loss of control. Leviticus adds shame and moral suspicion. Isolation is not just physical, it's existential. The sick person is cut off from the normal social and spiritual life, taught to see their condition as something that disqualifies them from belonging. Instead of comfort, they receive distance. Instead of solidarity, they receive silence. Over time, this teaches people to hide weakness. Illness becomes something to conceal rather than address openly. People learn that vulnerability risks exclusion, so they delay seeking help, minimize symptoms, or internalize blame for conditions beyond their control. Suffering becomes private and care becomes conditional. Sociologically, this system marginalizes the most vulnerable. The elderly, the chronically ill, the disabled, those most likely to experience ongoing physical differences are more easily pushed to the edges of communal life. Responsibility shifts away from collective care and toward individual management. Blame replaces support. The community is protected not by healing its members, but by removing them from view. Leviticus does not imagine a society organized around restoration. It imagines a society organized around containment. It doesn't ask how to heal you, only where to put you. Now let's talk about holiness. In Leviticus, holiness is not defined by compassion, justice, or care for others. It's defined by separation. To be holy is to be set apart, distinct, and insulated from difference. Moral excellence is not measured by how one treats the vulnerable, but how successfully one maintains boundaries. Difference itself is framed as danger, and proximity becomes a risk rather than an opportunity for understanding. This reframing has profound psychological consequences. When holiness is equated with separation, in group identity hardens into moral superiority. Those inside the boundary are not just different, they're better. Meanwhile, those outside the boundary are not merely unfamiliar, they're suspicious. Curiosity gives way to caution. Empathy is constrained by fear of contamination. Moral worth becomes something possessed rather than practiced. Over time, this produces an us versus them moral lens that feels righteous rather than defensive. People learn to interpret discomfort with difference as discernment and withdrawal as faithfulness. Compassion becomes conditional, extended primarily to those who already belong. The moral imagination narrows because engaging deeply with outsiders threatens the very identity that holiness is set to protect. This holiness model creates boundary obsession. Communities become preoccupied with who is in, who is out, and who is a little too close for comfort. Energy that could be spent addressing harm or fostering care is redirected toward maintaining distinction. Moral exceptionalism takes root. The belief that one group operates by a higher standard simply by virtue of separation. Accountability weakens inside the group while suspicion intensifies toward those outside it. This framework stabilizes hierarchy and exclusion. When separation is sacred, integration feels like compromise. When difference is dangerous, equality feels risky. The system doesn't need to argue against compassion, it only needs to redefine holiness so that compassion becomes optional. Leviticus doesn't teach holiness as being better, it teaches holiness as being a part. What seems to be codified in the book of Leviticus is that moral responsibility doesn't stop with the individual, it spreads. A single violation can render an entire household, camp, or community unclean. Guilt is not contained by intent or action, it's treated as contagious. Contamination logic replaces accountability logic. The question is no longer who did this, but who is now at risk because of it. Blame diffuses outward, and punishment follows proximity rather than culpability. This structure fundamentally alters how people relate to one another. When impurity can be spread, everyone becomes a potential liability. Trust erodes. Association becomes dangerous. Moral life shifts from mutual care to mutual monitoring. Instead of encouraging responsibility, the system incentivizes distance and suspicion. One person's mistake threatens everyone's standing. This produces fear based conformity. People learn quickly that deviation does not just endanger themselves, it endangers those they love. Silence becomes safer than honesty. Confession becomes risky. Accountability is replaced by concealment because exposure carries collective consequences. Moral growth stalls not because people don't care, but because the cost of openness is way too high. Over time, this conditions people to police themselves and each other. Anxiety replaces trust as the glue holding the community together. The safest behavior is not ethical reflection, but invisibility. People learn how to avoid being noticed rather than how to repair harm. Collective guilt creates self policing communities. Formal enforcement becomes almost unnecessary because surveillance is internalized. Neighbors monitor neighbors, families monitor members. Social pressure enforces conformity more efficiently than external punishment ever could. Informal reporting, exclusion, and shaming becomes tools of moral regulation, all justified as protecting the group. This system is remarkably durable. When everyone is responsible for everyone else's purity, authority does not need to watch constantly. The community does it for them. Fear becomes a stabilizing force. Order is maintained not through justice, but through mutual vulnerability to punishment. Leviticus reveals the cost of this logic clearly. One person's mistake becomes everyone's threat. On the surface, Leviticus is often dismissed as an ancient relic. an odd collection of rules from a distant world that no longer applies. And historically, that's partly true. Purity systems like the one in Leviticus were common across the ancient Near East. They emerged in fragile societies with limited medical knowledge, high mortality rates, and constant threats to group survival. These systems were designed to manage fear, uncertainty, and cohesion, not to articulate universal ethics grounded in empathy or human rights. They were survival technologies, not moral philosophies. The problem arises when a system built for ancient fragility is treated as timeless moral truth. What once functioned as a way to stabilize a vulnerable community becomes, in modern context, a mechanism for exclusion and control. Rules meant to manage disease, reproduction, and social order in a pre scientific world are repurposed as eternal standards, despite the fact that the conditions that produce them no longer exist. The system is preserved, but the context that justified it is gone. The deeper irony is how selectively this preservation works. Modern believers rarely follow most of Leviticus. Dietary laws are ignored, purity rituals are abandoned, sacrificial systems are spiritualized away. Yet the portions that reinforce hierarchy, sexual regulation, gender roles, bodily shame, clerical authority are often retained, defended, and enforced. What survives is not the whole system, but the parts that still serve power. This selectivity allows people to feel faithful without being burdened by the full weight of the text. The law becomes flexible when it inconveniences daily life, but rigid when it disciplines others. This creates a moral double standard where obedience is framed as principle, but only when it aligns with existing social norms and authority structures. Sociologically, this reveals the true function of Leviticus in modern religious life. It's not upheld because it provides a coherent ethical framework. It doesn't. It's preserved because it offers tools for boundary making, exclusion, and control. The text is not rejected because it's wrong. It's quietly ignored where it's costly and fiercely defended where it's useful. Leviticus doesn't feel outdated because it failed. It feels outdated because we no longer admit what it was designed to do. Leviticus isn't ignored because it's irrelevant, it's ignored because it's inconvenient. The reason Leviticus remains so fiercely defended despite being routinely ignored is not because it offers a compelling moral vision, but because too much collapses without it. If Leviticus fails, sin as contamination collapses with it. The idea that humans are not merely capable of harm, but are intrinsically defiling, loses its foundation. Moral failure can no longer be framed as something that clings to bodies, spreads through contact, or requires ritual cleansing rather than ethical repair. Once contamination logic weakens, blood atonement logic weakens as well. If impurity is no longer the core problem, then blood is no longer the necessary solution. Sacrifice stops making sense, not just animal sacrifice, but the broader theological logic that insists peace requires death. Without Leviticus, violence loses its ritual justification, and the idea that harm can cleanse harm becomes increasingly difficult to defend. Clerical authority also erodes. Leviticus is the text that formalizes mediation, inspection, and gatekeeping. It teaches that access to forgiveness, belonging, and restoration must be managed by an authorized class. If that framework collapses, authority must earn through wisdom, care, and accountability rather than inherited through position. The power pipeline breaks, control over access dissolves, body shame loses its divine backing. Body shame loses its divine backing as well. If natural processes are no longer framed as defilement, then fear of the body loses moral legitimacy. Sexuality, illness, reproduction, and difference can no longer be treated as spiritual threats by default. The body stops being a problem to manage and becomes a reality to understand. That shift alone destabilizes centuries of control rooted in disgust rather than harm. Psychologically, this is why Leviticus provokes such resistance. When a system has trained people to experience themselves as unclean, the promise of cleanliness becomes power. Letting go of that framework means relinquishing not just rules, but the emotional leverage those rules provide: guilt, fear, dependence, and relief through compliance. Sociologically, Leviticus functions as infrastructure. It doesn't just tell people what to do, it tells institutions how to operate. It teaches how to police bodies, enforce boundaries, centralize authority, and maintain order through ritual rather than justice. Without it, religion must renegotiate its relationship to power instead of assuming it. This is why Leviticus survives, not because it teaches morality, but because it teaches control. Thank you for hanging on to the end. Listen, what we're building at Bridge City is entering a season of intentional expansion. Our global campus is active and growing. People are forming real relationships through clubs, conversations, and shared experience. A dedicated group of volunteer leaders has already stepped into ownership of the mission, and together we're laying the groundwork for what comes next. Our focus moving forward is clear: experience, events, and education. First, experience. We're continuing to invest in the systems and teams that ensure every person who encounters Bridge City feels clarity, safety, and genuine human connection. That includes strengthening our member experience infrastructure and supporting the production, hospitality, and creative teams that bring our Sunday sessions and weekend experiences to life. Second is events. This year, we're expanding our event offerings to showcase what's possible when community experiences are designed intentionally around people, well produced, thoughtfully coordinated, and accessible. These gatherings are how connection becomes tangible and momentum becomes visible. And then, third, education. We're developing training and learning resources to equip people centric leaders and facilitators so this work can grow beyond a single space, voice, or moment. Education is how this movement becomes sustainable and transferable. To support this growth, we're building a staffed foundation that allows the mission to move forward with consistency, care, and long term focus. If you believe in what Bridge City is building and have the capacity to support it, we're asking you to give financially, either as a one time gift or as a recurring monthly partner. Your support directly funds the infrastructure that makes this work possible: the teams, systems, and capacity that allow community care and leadership to scale. This is about strengthening what's already working. Bridge City isn't a moment, it's infrastructure for human connection. And if you're in a position to invest in that work, we invite you to partner with us today using the link in the description below. Thank you for your support, and thank you for joining me in today's conversation. Until next time, keep rising.